William, Renata's eldest son, who displayed troubling behaviors. From a young age, he showed a tendency toward violence, especially against defenseless animals. The family discovered on multiple occasions skins of rabbits, cats, and dogs stretched out and drying in the sun. William's doing. The horror reached a climax when Welcome, horror buffs, to your ultimate destination for a heavy dose of bone-chilling encounters that will make your heart race and skin crawl uncontrollably. Are you ready for an intense rush of fear and thrill like never before? Then, let's dive straight into the stories. The story was posted by Constant Diamond 4627 on r/nosleep. When evil comes from the bloodline. At 14 years old, I lived in a vast 3-story house with my family. It belonged to my grandmother, whom we affectionately called Tita. The second floor was our home, my mother, my Aunt Carla, and I. On the third floor lived my Uncle Mario, with his wife Renata, his stepson, and the twins, Nicholas and Sophia. Sophia, my cousin, was 2 years younger than me and had health problems since birth. Renata, insisting on being treated only by her trusted doctor, put the twins at risk. She had waited a long time to give birth. Sophia, born second, suffered prolonged hypoxia, a lack of oxygen in her system, which led to epilepsy. She was on medication, and until then, her life had been relatively calm. One morning, like so many others, I went with my mother to let Nico and Sophia know that the school bus had arrived. On the third floor, Nicholas was having breakfast while Renata was showering, and my uncle was in the kitchen. Sophia was still in her room. Suddenly, a crashing sound shattered the air, glass breaking. My mother ran to Sophia's room, thinking she was having a seizure. But before she could enter, my cousin came out running, with a bloodied piece of glass in her hand. A red liquid dripped behind her, forming a trail with every step she took. Renata, the mother of the twins, screamed. The adults found her in the bathroom. I didn't see what happened. I only heard the screams and chaos. My mother asked me to take Nicholas to the bus and to leave the scene. I obeyed. At that moment, I was the older, or protective, figure for Nico. When I returned that afternoon, my Aunt Carla told me the truth. Sophia had broken a mirror and taken a shard to attack her mother. She had taken a piece of glass in her hand and pressed it so tightly that she cut herself, all to attack her mother. I still don't know how the adults, our parents, aunts, and uncles, had the courage to tell us, only the older children, what was happening. How do you explain that to a child? In the following days, Renata began to disappear more often. According to Tita, she was seeking help, convinced that what was happening to Sophia was not just physical or mental. She was blaming something beyond our comprehension. Meanwhile, my mother and I took care of Sophia. We soon noticed that Sophia would lose herself in her gaze, staring at some invisible point. If she managed to go to that place, things would happen. One night, my mother was in Renata's kitchen, making dinner. Since she was busy, she asked me to look after Sophia, to distract her. I don't know if you can grasp what my mother was asking of me. It's true that I'm the oldest, but that doesn't mean what was happening to my cousin didn't freeze my blood. I accepted, after all. I loved Sophia, and my mother couldn't handle everything. I found her in the living room trying to do her homework. While we spoke, her expression changed. She shifted from a happy girl telling me about her day into an absent, neutral figure, like a mannequin. Then, she turned her face to look at the end of the hallway, where only darkness lay. The same place where she ran to attack her mother with a piece of glass the first time. "Sophie?" I called nervously. She didn't respond. She stood up impulsively and began running toward the hallway. I only managed to shout for my mom to help and ran after her, grabbing her. My mother arrived just as I managed to stop her, holding her with all my strength. But Sophia, small and thin, had superhuman strength. I managed to hold her until my mother helped calm her down and took her to bed. From then on, the episodes became more violent. Sophia frequently attacked Renata. One afternoon, my mother ended up with a twisted finger trying to restrain her. It was unthinkable that an 11 or 12-year-old girl could exert such force and injure an adult woman. In our house, the tension was unbearable. Nicholas slept with fear or simply didn't sleep at all, saying that Sophia watched him at night. They shared a room, and apparently, at some point, Sophia would sit up abruptly and stare at her brother. At first, he thought it was a joke. "Come on, sister, stop it. Sleep." But nothing worked. He even tried throwing pillows at a distance to get Sophia to stop staring at him. In the end, he could only wait, nervously hoping the moment would pass quickly, covering his entire body and praying for the night to end. Sophia didn't remember anything that happened the next day. She believed Nico was just trying to prank her. Renata told him not to tell his sister about her condition to avoid worsening her state. The situation reached a climax one night. I heard a noise near the entrance to our floor. Remember, I lived on the second floor with my tita, my mother, and my Aunt Carla, while Renata and her family lived on the third floor. My room was closest to the entrance, so I must have been the one to notice the noise. "Lala, can you open the door?" It was Sophia. I recognized her voice, but something stopped me. In any other situation, I would have opened the door, but now, I felt I shouldn't. "Sophie, what are you doing there?" I asked. She didn't respond. She only repeated, "Lala, can you open the door?" "Sophie, go to sleep. We have to go to school tomorrow." "Lala, can you open the door?" she said again, this time with a more monotonous, emotionless tone. I thought something was wrong with Sophia, so I decided to go get my mom. When I came back, my mother opened the door with me behind her, looking over her shoulder. I was terrified, more than scared. It was distrust. There was no one there. The hallway connecting our entrance door to the stairs to the third floor was dark, but something was visible. My mother didn't notice. She told me to go to sleep and left. At that moment, I thought maybe I was imagining things. But there was something in the darkness. I could see something at the end of the hallway, right next to the stairs. I squinted my eyes and moved closer to the thing. Suddenly Sophia stood up and ran toward me. I reacted immediately, spinning on my feet, entering and slamming the door shut. It was a large metallic door, so the sound of the slam woke up my family. But it wasn't just the door's sound. It was mixed with the noise of something banging against it. Sophia. My mother ran in, asking what happened. As best I could, I told her I saw it. My mother asked my Aunt Carla to call Renata or Mario to inform them about what happened with Sophia. My mother wanted to open the door, but I was too scared. I didn't want her to open it. It wasn't good. I clung to my mother with fear while she approached the door. When she opened it, there was nothing. How was that possible? With that slam, I expected Sophia to be lying on the floor, unconscious. Then Aunt Carla arrived. Renata and Uncle Mario had spoken with her. Sophia was asleep in her bed. According to them, she hadn't left her room since she had gone to sleep. My aunt looked at me with disapproval, but my mother knew. She knew I wasn't lying. Maybe she was a little confused, but I wasn't lying. Something was happening. The next day, while my mother was telling Renata about what had happened, Renata confessed something that had been happening to her even before Sophie's first incident. Renata would wake up with bruises and scratches she couldn't explain. Along with the violent attacks from Sophie, this led her to decide to go to the neighborhood church. That was the place she had been going to every day, almost every afternoon until late at night. At that moment, I thought it couldn't be true. If it were, Sophie should already be fine, right? I don't know what made me follow Renata one of those afternoons. My mother had sent me to buy some things for dinner, and I took a little detour. We arrived at the church. I was clearly keeping a safe distance, but I managed to see how Renata was greeted by the priest. They exchanged greetings, and she handed him something wrapped in cloth. I remember Renata pulling it out of her purse. She removed a kind of red cord, like red threads, that were tied and holding whatever the cloth was covering. It was the priest who moved one side of the cloth. I was a bit far from them, hidden behind one of the wooden chairs in the temple. However, I managed to see something that looked like a lock of hair, right in the center of the cloth. I looked around. There was no one else in the church besides Renata, the priest, and me, hidden away. When I looked back, I saw the priest leading Renata toward the interior of something. There was a door where church supplies were supposedly kept, and I assumed they were going into that place. I decided to wait a bit, but they didn't come out in the next 10 minutes, and I had to return home with the groceries for dinner. I didn't tell my mother about what I saw. I didn't think it was appropriate. What if she scolded me for spying on the priest? I suppose that among all the adults in the family, they decided to bring the priest home. They gathered around him and told him about what had been happening in our family. Meanwhile, I had to keep an eye on all my little cousins. Some were playing, and Alex was talking to Sophie about something. My mind was split between my duties and my curiosity about the conversation the adults were having with the priest in the living room on our floor, the second floor. I don't know when Sophie walked up beside me and headed for the room where the meeting was taking place. All I know is that when I looked back at where Alex and Sophie were, she was gone. Alex just pointed to the door she had exited, and I ran after her. Sophie appeared in the room while the priest was performing a blessing. I only saw the expression of terror and surprise on the faces of most adults when they saw Sophie's face. I was behind her, so I wasn't a direct witness, but apparently her eyes were white, as if her irises were turned inward. Then she fell to the floor, convulsing like never before. What came out of her mouth wasn't her voice, but something guttural and inhuman. My mother and Renata tried to contain Sophie's convulsions. My Aunt Carla had the phone in hand, calling for emergency services. My Uncle Mario, Sophie's father, just stood there, like a stone statue, watching the chaos unfold. I ran to my tita to help her return to her room, and from there, I went to calm down my little cousins. I didn't know what the hell was happening. The priest continued praying. As if that would help, I thought, worried and angry at the priest's behavior. Exhausted, the priest, the same one who had received the lock of hair, declared that the evil tormenting Sophie had a blood origin, and then looked at Renata. She only managed to lower her gaze and burst into tears. I don't know if everyone understood what I did, but for me, Renata had done something. Something involving Sophie. Something connected to what I had witnessed that afternoon in the church. But I didn't say anything. Since that day, everything changed in our family. Sophie was taken to specialists and continued with spiritual visits, but never returned to being the same. Although she no longer suffered violent attacks, something in her had been extinguished, lost. They decided to move into an apartment far from the family home, and over time, we all eventually moved away. Over the years, the memory of those episodes remained buried but never completely disappeared. Recently, while speaking with my mother and my Aunt Carla, I decided to bring the topic back up. Something inside me told me that I didn't know the full truth. They exchanged a nervous glance before nodding, as if they had been expecting this moment for a long time. "It's time for you to know," said my mother in a solemn tone. What followed left me breathless. Renata had not always been my Uncle Mario's wife. Before him, she was married to a policeman named Jorge, with whom she had a son, William. According to my mother, Jorge was a violent man who controlled every aspect of Renata's life. It was during those years that Renata began doing things that no one in the family fully understood. One day, Renata told them she had attended a fire ritual. The ceremony involved a circle of flames being drawn around her, while a healer murmured words in an unknown language. Although she never explained the purpose, she hinted that it was to protect herself. My mother and my aunt speculated that it was something related to her ex-husband, and that she had resorted to such extremes during her marriage with George. Renata's behavior became even stranger after the death of her father. During the funeral, she and her sister walked 3 times over their father's grave, exactly 3 times, an act she never explained but that left everyone uneasy. Then came the advice she gave to a family acquaintance whose son was addicted to drugs. Renata suggested something disturbing, preparing a meal with sewer rat babies, assuring him that the dirtier they were, the better. According to the acquaintance, the ritual was to appease the rebellious spirit of the young man. The acquaintance later told this to my aunt with a worried tone, saying that the woman did very strange things, and it was better not to get involved with her. By then, my Uncle Mario had already married Renata civilly, and my aunt couldn't intervene in her son's life, even though she tried to warn others. My mother and aunt also spoke about William, Renata's eldest son, who displayed troubling behaviors. From a young age, he showed a tendency toward violence, especially against defenseless animals. The family discovered on multiple occasions skins of rabbits, cats, and dogs stretched out and drying in the sun. William's doing. The horror reached a climax when Sophia was 8 years old. Katie, Sophia's pet, had a litter of puppies. But one morning, all the puppies were found dead. My aunt said that William had killed them, seemingly pushing the tank into a wall instead of helping them when some got trapped behind it. The most terrifying incident involved a kitten William had. The kitten became pregnant and gave birth to 4 babies. A few days later, they found it covered in blood, with traces in its mouth and paws. Apparently, it had devoured its own kittens. My Aunt Carla ended with a warning. The animals behaved strangely around William, and, years later, around Sophia too. Hearing all of this, I realized that what I experienced with Sophia wasn't an isolated case, but part of something deeper, darker, and more twisted that had been brewing over the years. Then I remembered what the priest had said. The evil, tormenting Sophie had a blood origin. Even today, I still wonder if everything I lived through was real, if Sophia's experiences were a result of an illness or something else. And until now, I had remained silent about what I saw, about what Renata had done to Sophie, hiding as an observer. But I truly always felt guilty, an accomplice. Maybe, if I had spoken up, if Sophie would still be with us. Let's now move on to another scary story from Weird-Suggestion-152. In deep Appalachia, Halloween night comes with rules. I've lived my entire life in a holler on the outskirts of Wyoming County, West Virginia, deep in the mountains of Appalachia. It's a place so remote most folks don't even know it exists on a map. Just a handful of families, and dense, unforgiving woods. This place doesn't have neighborhoods, doesn't have sidewalks, and most definitely does not have trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Halloween isn't a holiday here, it's a test. My family, and the others who've lived here long enough to know, follow a set of rules on Halloween night. It's not tradition or superstition. It's survival. Those who didn't follow the rules didn't live long enough to tell anyone about it. Our rules aren't just about keeping doors locked or avoiding dark places. They're specific, with reasons rooted in events we don't talk about. My dad always said they came from my great-grandmother's time, when people came to these mountains from Scotland and still believed in the old ways. Whether it's spirits, or something else that's out there, or things just too old to name, Halloween night here has always been a game of life and death. And each rule existed to give you just enough of an edge to make it through till morning. The first time I broke a rule, I learned why they exist. and I'll never forget it. Every October, around the second week, the rules went up on the fridge. We lived by them. My family took them seriously, and not just in a keep the kids safe kind of way. No, these rules were for everyone. Break one, and you'd put us all in danger. Here's how they go. If you hear 3 knocks at the door after sunset, do not answer. If you hear a single hard knock, open the door, but do not look at who stands there. Hold out a basket of freshly baked bread and wait until you hear the footsteps leaving to shut the door. If you hear someone call your name from the woods, do not answer. If you see a figure at the tree line wearing a wide-brimmed hat, do not look at him for longer than 1 second. If you hear chains dragging on the ground, sprinkle salt on all windowsills and door thresholds within 1 minute. If a candle is burning in the window of the old, abandoned Anderson cabin up the hill, stay indoors, no matter what. These rules didn't exist for no reason. They were handed down because bad things had happened. People vanished, people died, and strange things occurred. That's just how it was. I remember one specific year, years back, when Halloween night fell on a full moon. The air felt different, charged. My dad had a sense for when things were going to be bad. You could just feel it in the holler, thick in the air, like something breathing down your neck. Dad told us to get all the preparations done early. "Salt the windows now," he instructed, standing by the door, his face tight with worry. "We're not waiting for the chains." I followed his orders without question, pouring salt along each windowsill and at the front and back door thresholds. My brother was baking bread, already anticipating rule number 2, the one we hated the most. It was the one that forced us to interact with whatever knocked, whatever stood on the other side of that door. We never knew who or what it was, but we knew if you didn't offer bread, or if you dared to look, it wouldn't be good. By late afternoon, the house was fortified. The bread was cooling on the counter, its smell filling the kitchen. The fire was lit, burning low, and a 12-gauge lay across Dad's lap like it always did on Halloween. Isaac, my younger brother, sat closest to the window, glancing out every now and then. We had about 3 hours before sunset. The rules were clear. Everything bad happened after dark. But the waiting was the worst part. The longer we sat there, the more anxious we became. "Did we use enough salt this year?" Isaac asked quietly. Dad didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, gripping the gun tighter. That was answer enough. The first knock came just after dark, a single knock, slow and deliberate. Isaac and I froze, staring at the door. Dad stood up, motioning for us to stay back and be quiet. I swallowed hard, heart pounding in my chest. It was time to follow Rule 2. Without a word, Dad picked up the basket of bread from the counter, freshly baked, still warm. He walked to the door, resting one hand on the knob. "Remember," he said, his voice low and steady, "don't look." He opened the door just wide enough to slip the basket through the crack, his eyes focused on the floor. The warm smell of the bread wafted out, and I could hear a faint shuffling on the porch. Whoever, or whatever it was out there. I saw a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow stretching across the porch, but I didn't dare look. Dad held the basket out, his hand shaking slightly. For a few heartbeats, there was no sound, no movement, and then, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps retreating from the porch. He waited until they faded completely, then shut the door quietly, locking it tight. Isaac let out a breath. "Why don't we just leave the bread out early? Why do we have to wait for the knock?" Dad's face was pale and his eyes were hard. "We have to wait for the knock, and if we don't answer the knock, it'll come in." We thought it was over. We had followed Rule 2 to the letter, and for a moment, it seemed like things were quiet. But here, nothing stays quiet for long on Halloween. Isaac was the first to notice him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just where the trees meet the clearing. He was tall and thin, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but he was there, watching. Isaac gasped, pointing. "It's him," he whispered, voice trembling. Dad didn't need to ask who. He knew. We all did. The man in the hat. "Don't look at him," Dad snapped. Not for more than a second. I glanced, just enough to confirm he was there. A tall, dark figure, almost blending into the shadows of the trees, but distinct enough to make my blood run cold. I looked away quickly, heart hammering in my chest. We got away from the doors and windows of the house and sat huddled in the living room, the fire our only light. Outside, the man in the hat stood at the tree line, unmoving as the night crept on. It wasn't until after midnight that we heard the chains. At first, it was faint, a metallic clinking that seemed distant, almost like it could have been the wind, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The sound of chains being dragged across the rocky ground outside. Isaac's face turned pale. He shot me a look, wide-eyed and terrified. "The salt," he whispered. Dad nodded grimly. "Go check." I got up slowly, trying to control the tremor in my legs. I circled the house, inspecting every window and door frame. The salt lines were intact. Nothing had disturbed them. The chains continued to scrape outside, dragging closer and closer. But we didn't dare open the door. We didn't dare look. We stayed inside, sitting together in the flickering light of the fire, listening to the sound of the chains until the first light of dawn broke through the windows. We had made it through the night. The man in the hat was gone. The chains had stopped. But as the morning light seeped through the shutters, I glanced toward the old Anderson cabin up the hill, and there it was, a single candle still burning in the window. The rules are clear. When the candle burns in the Anderson cabin, you stay inside. No exceptions, no excuses. Even with the sun beginning to shine and the birds beginning to chirp, the sight of that candle filled me with a primal fear. We have to wait until the candle goes out before we can go outside, before the night is truly over. And that's how it goes here. The rules aren't just there to be followed. They're there to keep you alive. And if you're smart, you don't ask questions. Sometimes it's better not to know. Halloween here had always been terrifying, but last year was different. It wasn't just the usual unease or the normal anxiety that came with the setting sun. It almost felt like the rules weren't enough anymore. My dad was getting older, his movements slower, his hands a little less steady. We all knew it, but no one said anything. We just followed the rules like always, hoping that would be enough. We spent the day in preparation, salting the windows, baking the bread, the usual. Isaac and I were jittery, pacing around, double-checking everything. With my dad getting older, we felt a greater pressure to take it upon ourselves to prepare. The sky darkened faster than usual, clouds rolling in from the west, blotting out the last rays of the sun. By the time dusk fell, the fire was burning low, and the house sat in darkness. Dad sat in his usual spot by the door, the shotgun across his lap. The basket of bread, fresh out of the oven, sat next to him. We all waited, our hearts pounding in the silence. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see the figure in the hat or hear the drag of chains. And then it came. A single knock, loud and deliberate. Dad stood up, just like every other year. "Stay put," he muttered, picking up the basket with his trembling hands. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. Isaac and I exchanged a nervous glance as Dad approached the door. As always, I stared at the floor, focusing on the sound crackling fire and trying to block out the sense of dread that had settled in my gut. He opened the door a crack, just enough to push the basket through without seeing whatever waited on the other side. But this time, something went wrong. As Dad leaned forward, he knocked the basket against the doorframe and lost his grip. The bread tumbled out, scattering across the porch. The sudden movement, the noise. Without thinking, I looked up. I looked at it, and I saw it. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything I could name. It stood hunched over, far too tall to be human. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its face was sunken, like a skull with pale white skin pulled tight over it, and its eyes were wild and wide, too wide, like it didn't have eyelids. Its mouth opened unnaturally wide, a black, gaping hole that emitted a horrible, deafening wail. It was a sound I had never heard before, like metal scraping against stone, but worse. It drilled into my skull, making my ears ring and my vision blur. Before I could react, before I could even scream, the thing lunged. Its bony hand shot out, grabbing my dad by the collar. In one terrifyingly quick motion, it yanked him off the porch, dragging him toward the woods. The sound of his body scraping against the ground, his muffled cries, and the creature's horrible wail all blurred together into a scene of pure terror. Isaac screamed first. I was frozen, my mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. But Isaac's scream jolted me back to reality. "Dad!" Isaac yelled, bolting for the door. I followed, my legs shaking, and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. We ran out into the cold night air, toward the edge of the woods, where we could still hear Dad's faint cries. But before we could take more than a few steps, I saw it. The candle. A single flickering light in the window of the old Anderson cabin. My blood ran cold. We had come outside when the candle was burning. I grabbed Isaac's arm, pulling him to a stop. "Wait," I whispered, voice shaking. "The cabin!" As if on cue, the door of the cabin suddenly flew open with a loud crash, as if something unseen was about to come storming out. Something angry. Something that should not have been awakened. "We have to go," I shouted, dragging Isaac back toward our house. We scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. I locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. The shotgun was still on the floor by Dad's chair, but it felt useless. What good would it do against something like that? But the night was far from over. We huddled in the living room, terrified, waiting for the next rule to break. Isaac was crying, his hands shaking as he tried to steady his breathing. I stared at the door, half expecting something to come crashing through at any moment. The chains came next. We heard them clattering on the ground, dragging closer and closer. I grabbed the bag of salt, getting ready to double-check the lines of salt we had placed down earlier. The chains dragged right up to the front door, the metallic clinking echoing in the silence. I could hear it just outside, scraping against the wooden steps of the porch, but I knew the salt would hold. It always did. Or so I thought. Isaac was the first to notice it. We had forgotten to result the front door threshold after going outside. The wind from the open door had disturbed our salt line. Just as I was about to rush toward the door to result it, I heard the chains and a creaking against the door. It sounded as though a heavy weight was slowly leaning against it. I knew we didn't have time. I began to back away, motioning to Isaac to go to the bedroom. Isaac screamed as the door burst open. We ran into the back bedroom, hearts pounding, breaths coming in ragged gasps. I quickly salted in front of the door to the bedroom and checked the windows. "It's in the house," I whispered. I could feel it, a presence, something cold and malevolent, creeping through the house toward us. I don't know how long we waited, or how long we listened to the chains pacing back and forth through our house. Eventually, we heard them go back outside. Slowly, we left the bedroom and quietly closed and locked the front door. I placed a fresh line of salt in front of the door and breathed a sigh of relief. We were safe for now. And then we heard it again. A knock. But not the single knock, and not the 3 knocks. This was something new, something that didn't fit the rules. It was a rapid, frantic pounding, as if whatever was out there wanted in, now. My heart stopped. The rules didn't cover this. Isaac looked at me, eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The pounding grew louder, more desperate. The windows rattled in their frames, and the fire flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. Whatever was out there was angry, angrier than anything I had ever felt before. "We just wait," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. "We wait until daylight." The rest of the night was a blur of terror. Every minute felt like an hour. Every sound made my heart leap into my throat. We didn't sleep. We didn't dare move from the living room. We huddled together in front of the fire, clutching the shotgun like it was our last hope, and quietly crying over the loss of our father. The pounding on the door never stopped. The chains outside the house dragged back and forth, a constant reminder of the horror that waited just beyond the walls. And through it all, the candle in the Anderson cabin burned bright, flickering in the distance like a beacon of death. But somehow we made it. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the sounds stopped. The pounding ceased. The chains fell silent. The candle in the cabin flickered out. We had survived another year. Barely. But Dad never came back. Halloween in our holler had always been a test. But last year, it wasn't enough. Breaking the rules cost my dad his life, and everything is different. And I can't shake the feeling that this Halloween will be worse. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more thrilling horror stories like these. Also, share your thoughts on the story in the comment section below. If you want me to feature your own story on this channel, you are most welcome. Send your story to the email provided in the description below.